There is a moment late at night when the noise finally stops. The phone is quiet. The room is dim. And something rises up that you have been outrunning all day. It is not quite sadness. It is not quite fear. It is something older than both. Something you have been carrying so long that you have started to think it is simply who you are. Tonight, we are going to sit with that feeling, not to fix it, not to explain it away, but to understand it. The way you understand an old letter you have read 100 times but never quite fully received. Because Carl Jung believed something that most of us resist. The wound beneath your identity is not a mistake. It is the beginning of the story. Let your shoulders drop a little. You do not have to do anything with what you hear tonight. Just listen. Here is the first thing to know. Jung spent his entire career asking one question from many different angles. The question was this: why do people become who they are instead of who they were meant to be? Not in a blaming way, not as an accusation, as a genuine mystery. He watched patients in his clinic in Zurich. He watched colleagues spiral into despair. He watched himself, in the years after his break with Freud, come very close to something he could only describe as dissolution. The ground beneath him felt unreliable. The self he had built, the accomplished psychiatrist, the confident theorist, cracked at the edges. And in that cracking, something revealed itself. He called it the wound, not a metaphor, exactly. A real thing. A place in the psyche where life had pressed down so hard and so early that something inside closed around the pressure like scar tissue forming over a splinter. And here is what makes this worth paying attention to tonight. Jung did not say the wound destroys you. He said the wound shapes you. He said the things you struggle with most, the patterns you cannot escape, the fears that return in different clothes, the hunger that no amount of success seems to fill, all of these have a root. And the root is intelligent. It was doing something important once. Understanding it does not mean reopening old pain. It means finally seeing something that has been running quietly in the background for decades. And there is a question worth holding tonight, gently. We will not answer it yet, but hold it. Why does the past feel, sometimes, like it is still happening? Not as a memory, but as something present. As something that shows up in the tightness of your chest before a difficult conversation. In the way you pull back when someone gets too close. In the way you work yourself past the point of exhaustion, as if stopping would cost you something you cannot name. We will come back to that question. The answer lives in what we explore tonight. For now, know this. Jung was not a man who believed in hopeless cases. He was a man who believed that what you call your worst quality might also be your most honest one. That what you have hidden from others, from yourself, is not nothing. It is the part of you that survived. And surviving, he believed, is where consciousness begins. There is a second kind of wound, by the way. Most people only ever know the first kind. The second one is quieter and in some ways more important. We will find it together, somewhere in the hours ahead. But first, we begin where every real story begins, not with the event, with the moment before it, with who you were before the world had its say. Let the weight of your body rest in whatever is holding you right now. We are in no hurry. This story has been waiting long enough. Chapter 2. Why Pain Becomes Personality. Picture a child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. Not a broken child. Not a dramatic story of obvious harm. Just a child trying to figure out how the world works, which behaviors get warmth and which ones get silence. The child learns quickly. All children do. They learn what to show and what to hide. They learn which feelings are welcome at the dinner table and which ones make the room go cold. They learn what version of themselves gets love, and they begin, very naturally, to become that version. Jung called this adaptation, and for a while it works perfectly well. This is where personality begins. Not in our DNA, not in our deliberate choices, but in this invisible negotiation between who we are and what the world around us seems to require. And here is the strange thing about that process. The qualities we learn to suppress do not disappear. They go somewhere. They go into what Jung called the shadow, that unseen part of the self where everything we could not show or were told we should not be finds a kind of refuge. A boy who is told that crying is weakness does not lose his grief, he loses access to it. A girl who learns that anger is unattractive does not lose her anger, she loses the right to name it. A man who builds a life around performance and achievement does not lose his doubt. He builds a very tall building over it. And the wound, in Jung's thinking, is not always what happened to you. Sometimes it is what was not allowed to happen. The feeling that had no room. The question that never got an honest answer. The need that was too inconvenient to be named. Seneca, writing in ancient Rome almost 2,000 years ago, observed something that sounds almost clinical in its precision. He said, "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." He meant that we build internal worlds from the impressions we receive early in life, and those worlds run in the background, like a program, long after the original circumstances have changed. The pain does not always stay as pain. That is what makes it hard to find. It transforms. It becomes a way of being. The child who learns that love is conditional may become the adult who works tirelessly to earn approval. The child who learns that safety requires invisibility may become the adult who shrinks in rooms where they deserve to take up space. The child who was punished for their neediness may become the adult who can never ask for help. The personality is not a mask exactly. It is more like a sculpture shaped by early pressure. And most of us walk through our adult lives completely unaware that the sculpture was built in response to something. We think this is simply who we are. Jung said, not exactly. He said, this is who you became, which is different, because what became can also become something else. There is a phrase he used that I want to plant here quietly, and we will return to it. He spoke of the unlived life, all the things you are that never got to fully exist, all the parts of you that went underground because there was no safe place for them above. We will find out what that means tonight. But not yet. For now, just notice, without judgment, whether any version of this sounds familiar. Whether there is a version of yourself you perform and a version of yourself you rarely show anyone. Whether the two feel very different, or whether you have been one so long that you have almost forgotten the other exists. Let the next breath come a little slower. You do not have to solve anything tonight. You just need to listen to the story that has been trying to tell itself for a very long time. Chapter 3. The Childhood Split. Think of the mind as a house. A large house with many rooms. Some of the rooms are lit and furnished. You live in those rooms. You know where everything is. You move through them with ease. Other rooms have been closed for years. The doors are shut. You do not go in. You may have even forgotten they exist. This is not a metaphor for dysfunction. It is simply what happens when we grow up inside conditions that could not hold all of who we were. Jung observed that the psyche, like any living system, finds ways to manage what it cannot fully process. When an experience is too overwhelming, or a feeling too dangerous, or a need too threatening, the mind does something elegant and practical. It separates. It creates a kind of inner compartment, and it places the unbearable thing inside, and it locks the door. He called these compartments complexes, not in the casual way the word is used now, but in a precise sense. A complex is a pocket of the unconscious built around an emotionally charged experience. And it does not stay still. It grows. It organizes other experiences around itself. It builds a kind of gravity that pulls related feelings and memories into its orbit. And here is what makes complexes so influential in our adult lives. They do not wait to be visited, they visit us. Imagine someone who, as a child, experienced criticism from a parent in a very particular way. Sudden, cutting, without explanation. Over time, the psyche builds a complex around that wound. Criticism, sudden, unexplained. Loss of warmth. Years later, that person is in a meeting at work. A colleague offers a perfectly neutral observation about their project. And something happens in the body, a tightening, a flushing, a disproportionate wave of heat that has almost nothing to do with the colleague and almost everything to do with the room from decades ago. The complex spoke, and it sounded, for a moment, like the present. This is the childhood split Jung described, not a dramatic fracture, a gradual, sensible, protective division between what could be known and what had to be stored. Viktor Frankl, the psychiatrist who survived conditions far more extreme than a difficult family dinner, said something that fits here. He observed that when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. The child cannot change the family, so the child changes, reshapes their inner world to survive within it. That reshaping is not failure, it is wisdom. It is the mind doing exactly what minds do best, adapting, preserving, finding a way through. Now, the difficulty comes later, when you are 40 or 50 or 60, and you are no longer in that original situation, but the adaptation is still running. The room is different. The people are different. And still the old alarm sounds in the old way, for reasons your adult self can barely trace. Notice the weight of your body where it rests. There is something quietly useful in knowing this. If a feeling in your life seems disproportionate to its trigger, that is not proof that you are broken. It is a signal. It is the locked room asking to be opened. Not today, necessarily. Not tonight, but at some point the house deserves to be whole again. And that process of moving through the house, opening doors, learning what is inside, is what Jung called individuation, the lifelong work of becoming all of who you are, not just the parts that were safe to show. We have only just begun to walk through this house. There are rooms ahead that will feel familiar in ways you might not expect. Chapter 4. The Mask of Adaptation. There is a word Jung used that is worth pausing on: persona. It comes from the Latin word for the masks worn by actors in ancient theatre, the carved faces that told the audience from a distance which character was speaking. The hero, the villain, the fool, the wise man. Jung borrowed the word because he believed each of us wears something very similar, not as deception, as necessity. From childhood onward, we develop a social self, a curated version of who we are that allows us to function in groups, families, workplaces, friendships. The persona is how we meet the world. It is the professional confidence we wear in the boardroom, the calm competence we put on when the children need us, the easy smile at the party when we are actually exhausted, the measured, reasonable tone we use in the email when what we feel is something far less measured. None of this is dishonest, exactly. It is the natural cost of living among other people. The problem begins when the persona becomes the only self. When the mask is worn so consistently for so long that the face beneath it goes numb from disuse. When you can no longer remember what you actually want because the persona wants what it is supposed to want. When you succeed at being who everyone needs you to be and feel hollow at the center of it, there is a story in this. Imagine a person who spent 40 years building a career out of capability. They were the one who solved things, the one everyone turned to, the steady presence in every difficult meeting, every family crisis, every emergency that required someone to stay calm. And they were good at it, genuinely good. The capability was real. But somewhere along the way, the capability became the whole story. The private doubts, the grief they never quite processed, the question of whether any of it was what they actually wanted, all of that went into the locked room. And the capable person kept walking forward, one room at a time, keeping the door behind them firmly shut. The mask became so natural that they forgot it was a mask. They thought this steady, capable, needs-nothing version of themselves was the truth. Jung was not unsympathetic to this. He did not say, "Stop performing." He said, "Know that you are performing. Know which parts of the performance are chosen and which parts are compulsory. Know where you end and the role begins. Because the mask that you cannot take off is the one that will eventually wear through from the inside." The psyche, Jung believed, will not be permanently denied. It finds ways to speak, sometimes in symptoms, the unexplained anxiety, the insomnia, the irritability, without clear cause. Sometimes in dreams that feel more real than waking life. Sometimes in the flatness that descends after an achievement, when relief comes but joy does not. Let your jaw soften a little. You may recognize some version of this. You may know the version of yourself that shows up in public, reliably, competently, charmingly. And you may also know, quietly, in the part of the night that belongs only to you, that version is not the whole story. That is not a failure. That is the beginning of honesty. And honesty, Jung believed, is where the real work begins. Not honesty with others, not first. Honesty with yourself. The willingness to ask, what am I not allowing myself to be? The question does not demand an immediate answer. It just needs to be asked. Somewhere in the house, there is a room you have not opened in years, and the door you may find is not locked from the outside. Chapter 5, The Birth of the Shadow. Here is something Jung noticed early in his career that never left him. Everything that a person cannot accept in themselves, they will eventually see in someone else. The person who refuses to acknowledge their own anger will be surrounded, it seems, by angry people. The person who hides their neediness will be repelled by neediness in others. The person who suppresses their ambition will feel strangely irritated by those who show it openly. This is the shadow at work. The shadow is not evil. That is the misunderstanding that most people bring to this idea. The shadow is simply the part of the psyche that had nowhere to go in the light. Everything that did not fit the persona, the messiness, the resentment, the vulnerability, the desire, the grief, the rage, the tenderness, these do not vanish. They become the shadow. They travel with us out of sight, influencing us in ways we rarely trace. Jung wrote that what you cannot face in yourself, you will meet as fate. He meant that the qualities you disown will organize themselves outside of you. They will find expression through your relationships, your reactions, the situations you seem to attract again and again. There is a story that has stayed with me from his case notes. A man came to Jung describing his wife as impossibly demanding, unreasonably emotional, impossible to satisfy. He had been patient for years, he said. He had given everything. He was the reasonable one. Jung listened, and then he asked quietly, "When was the last time you needed something from someone else?" The man had no answer. He had built a life on not needing, on being the capable one, the stable one, the one above the fray. And everything he had denied in himself, the need, the feeling, the hunger for connection, he experienced intensely in his wife. Not because she was not real, but because she had become the screen onto which he projected what he could not claim. This is projection, and it is one of the shadow's favorite tools. We do not do this consciously. No one chooses it. It happens as naturally as light casting a shadow when something stands in its way. The practical question, the one worth sitting with tonight, is this. The people who irritate you most reliably, who get under your skin in a very specific way, who trigger something outsized in you that you cannot quite account for, what quality do they have that you have not allowed yourself to have? Not always. The shadow theory is not a hammer that makes everything a nail. Sometimes difficult people are simply difficult. But sometimes the heat of a reaction tells you something. Sometimes the thing that most offends you about another person is the thing you have most carefully refused in yourself. Feel the weight of your body against what is holding you. Jung did not present this as an accusation. He presented it as a doorway. Because the shadow, when you can begin to see it, becomes the most direct route to what is alive in you. All that energy, all that passion, all that force that went underground, it is still there. It is still yours. It has just been waiting for you to claim it. And claiming it does not mean becoming it. It means integrating it, knowing it exists, giving it some form of conscious expression so that it stops finding expression in ways you did not choose. We have now planted 3 questions to hold. Why does the past feel present? What is the unlived life? And what quality in others is actually a signal from yourself? All 3 have answers. We are building toward them. Rest for a moment. Let the next breath be a little slower. The journey through this house is just beginning. Chapter 6. Trauma and the unconscious. There is a difference between a wound that heals and a wound that becomes part of the architecture. Most physical injuries, if tended to, close. They leave a scar sometimes. But the skin grows back, the function returns, the body moves on. Some emotional injuries work differently, not because the person is weak, because the experience was too large, too sudden, or too sustained for the ordinary processes of the mind to digest it. These experiences do not become memories in the usual sense. They become something else. Bessel van der Kolk, a psychiatrist who spent decades studying the way traumatic experience lives in the body, described this with a phrase that has stayed with many of his readers. The body keeps the score. By which he meant, even when the mind cannot consciously access an old wound, the body remembers it, holds it, expresses it in tension, in avoidance, in patterns of response that make no sense to the rational mind. Jung understood this long before the language of neuroscience was available to him. He spoke of the unconscious not as an absence, but as a presence, a living layer of the mind that holds everything the conscious self cannot metabolize. And he observed something clinically important. The contents of the unconscious do not disappear with time. They intensify. They become more insistent, not less. They find new forms of expression. Think of water that has nowhere to go. It does not evaporate simply because you do not look at it. It finds a way through, seeping into the foundations, emerging in unexpected places, gradually reshaping what it cannot escape. The unprocessed wound works this way. It shows up in the dreams that leave you shaken and unable to explain why. In the physical symptoms that no doctor can fully account for, the tightness that appears in your chest at certain kinds of gatherings, the fatigue that arrives like a sentence, the headache that begins whenever you are expected to perform. It shows up in your relationships, in the patterns that repeat so reliably that they begin to feel like fate, in the way you keep finding yourself in situations that echo something from a long time ago. Jung was not fatalistic about this. He was insistent, in fact, on the opposite. He believed the psyche has what he called a self-regulating function, a built-in drive toward wholeness, toward health, toward integration. The symptoms are not simply suffering. They are the psyche's way of pressing toward something it needs. The anxiety that arrives at 2 a.m. is not just anxiety. It is the mind trying, in its particular and sometimes clumsy way, to make you pay attention to something you have been looking past. Let your shoulders drop. This does not mean that every symptom is meaningful, or that you should carry the weight of interpretation on top of the weight of the experience itself. It means something simpler. When something returns again and again, a feeling, a fear, a relational pattern, a kind of pain, it is worth asking, quietly, what is this trying to tell me? Not demanding an answer right now, just asking. Frankl said that what cannot be changed must be transformed. He meant that when circumstances cannot be altered, the response to them can evolve. The wound cannot be made not to have happened. But the meaning of it, what it takes from you, what it gives you, how it shapes what comes next, that is not written in stone. That transformation does not happen all at once. And it does not happen only in the light. Some of the most important work of healing happens in the dark, in sleep, in dreams, in the slow, quiet rearranging of things the mind does when you are not watching. You may already be doing this work without knowing it. The house is doing its own renovation in its own time. Chapter 7. The inner critic speaks. There is a voice that most people know well, even if they have never named it. It speaks most clearly at night, when the day's noise retreats and there is nothing left to do. It arrives with its particular inventory. The thing you said that came out wrong, the decision you second-guess, the gap between who you are and who you intended to be. It is precise. It rarely misses. Jung called this voice the inner critic, though he understood it as one expression of the shadow, the part of the self that contains everything the psyche has been told is unacceptable. The inner critic knows your weaknesses because it was built from them. It knows exactly where to press. And here is what makes it so persistent. The inner critic is not simply a tormentor. It was once a protector. The voice that now says, "You always get this wrong," may have originally sounded like something else. It may have sounded like a parent whose approval was unpredictable, so vigilance seemed necessary. Or a teacher whose disappointment was sharp, so perfectionism felt like armor. Or a culture that required a certain standard of performance in exchange for belonging. The critic internalized those messages and made them automatic. It does not wait to be summoned. It runs continuously, in the background, monitoring for failure the way a security system monitors for intrusion. The psychologist Ethan Kross studied something he called chatter, the voice in the head that narrates experience in anxious, self-critical ways. He found that when people speak to themselves in the second person, "You always do this," the emotional heat of the experience increases. The distance collapses. The criticism feels immediate and total. He found something else. When people could adopt a slight observational distance, speaking to themselves by name, or stepping back just enough to watch the thought rather than be the thought, the intensity shifted. Not dramatically, but measurably. The critic was still there, but its voice no longer filled the whole room. Jung would have appreciated this finding. He believed that consciousness, the simple act of seeing something clearly, already changes its relationship to you. The inner critic loses some of its power the moment you can say, without panic, "There it is, that is the critic speaking, that is not the whole truth about me." Picture a room at 2 a.m. Someone lies awake, running through a list that has no end. Every missed thing, every unkind moment, every choice that branched the wrong way, the list is real. The facts are real. But the voice assembling them, the voice that says, "This is who you are, this is the sum of you," that voice is not neutral. That voice has an agenda, and the agenda is not understanding. The agenda is vigilance, constant monitoring, the exhausting project of staying ahead of failure by cataloguing it first. Notice the air coming in and out. There is a gentler way to hold all of this. Not denial, not dismissing the things the critic names, but asking, what would I say to someone I love if they brought me this same list? You would not read it back to them. You would not agree that they are the sum of their worst moments. You would say something true and kind. You would say, I know you are tired. I know you are trying. The list does not define you. That same conversation is available to you any night you choose to have it. The critic was never your enemy. It was just doing the only job it knew. Tonight, it can rest. Chapter 8. Self-worth and the false self. Here is a question worth sitting with quietly. Where did you first learn what you were worth? Not in an abstract way, in a felt way. The daily, specific language of worth, of what earned warmth and what did not, of what you had to do to deserve the room, of which parts of you were welcomed and which were quietly corrected. Most of us cannot answer this question directly. The learning happened before language, before the kind of self-awareness that allows for clear reflection. It happened in the way a parent's face changed when you cried too long, in the praise that came for certain achievements and the silence that followed certain feelings, in the sibling whose different presence seemed to shift the temperature of the house. Jung drew a distinction between the ego, the self you know, the self you present, the self that navigates the world, and the self with a capital S, which he meant as something larger. The deeper organizing center of the psyche, the wholeness that exists beneath all the adaptations. The false self, in this framework, is the ego that has forgotten it is not the whole story. The version of you that became so convinced of its own constructed identity that it stopped looking for anything beneath it. It is worth saying clearly, the false self is not a lie. It is not a performance in the dishonest sense. It is a genuine adaptation. It is the version of yourself that had to take shape in order for you to survive the conditions you were given. But it is not all of you. And the cost of inhabiting it entirely, of treating it as the final version rather than one layer among many, is a particular kind of hollowness. A success that does not satisfy. A connection that does not quite reach the place inside that needs it most. A life that looks correct from the outside and feels incomplete from within. A psychologist once asked a patient a question that the patient never forgot. The patient had come in describing their achievements, their relationships, their reasonable life. And the psychologist listened patiently and then asked, "Who are you when you are not performing?" The patient opened their mouth and had nothing to say. Not because the answer was painful, because they genuinely did not know. The performing had been so complete, so practiced, so much the entirety of daily life, that the self beneath it had become a stranger. That moment of not knowing is not a failure. Jung would say it is exactly the right beginning. Because the question itself, who am I, beneath the role I play, is one of the most important questions a person can ask. And it can only be asked from the ground of enough safety to look. Let the weight of your body settle a little more. You are safe enough tonight to look. Not to find the answer immediately. The answer does not arrive like a headline. It arrives slowly, over time, the way a room becomes familiar after you have spent enough time in it. The way a face becomes known, the more you allow yourself to really look. Your worth was never a performance. It was always already there, beneath the performing. The work is not to create something new. The work is to remember something old. Chapter 9. Emotional Pain as Symbol. Jung was trained as a medical doctor. He believed in evidence, in precision, in the careful observation of what actually appeared in front of him. And what appeared in front of him again and again was this. Emotional pain had a language. If you listened carefully enough, suffering was trying to say something. It was not merely noise to be eliminated. It was signal. This is a different way of understanding pain from the one most of us were taught. Most of us learned a simple model. Pain is bad. The goal is to remove it. The faster you remove it, the better. Success is the absence of pain. Jung looked at the patients who had tried to live by that model, who had suppressed, medicated, distracted, performed, and worked their way around their suffering for decades. And he noticed something. The pain they had never allowed to speak had found other ways to speak. Through the body, through relationships, through symptoms that arrived with what felt like cruel precision. He came to believe that psychological symptoms were not random afflictions. They were the psyche's attempt at communication. Clumsy sometimes, indirect often, but purposeful. The anxiety that appears before every significant decision is not simply malfunction. It may be the psyche's way of saying, "This matters to you more than you have admitted. This is worth paying attention to." The grief that surfaces at strange moments during a beautiful piece of music, or at the edge of sleep, or while watching something ordinary and small, is not simply the past disrupting the present. It may be the part of you that never had permission to mourn, finally finding a quiet crack in the busy day. The anger that arrives disproportionate to the trigger is often not about the trigger at all. It is old anger, held too long, finding a current address. Pain as symbol does not mean pain is deserved. It does not mean suffering is a lesson you needed to learn. It means that even in the worst of what we carry, something intelligent is at work, pressing toward recognition, toward integration, toward the wholeness the psyche always seems to be seeking. Kierkegaard wrote that life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards. There is a version of this that applies to pain. You may not understand what a particular suffering was for until long after it arrives, and that is acceptable. You do not have to decode every feeling as it comes. But it is worth knowing that the feeling is not random, that your inner life is not chaos, that beneath the noise there is a direction. Let your jaw soften a little. Tonight, if something rises that you cannot name, a heaviness, a restlessness, an ache that seems sourceless, you do not need to immediately make it stop. You can let it be there. You can treat it for a moment as a letter that arrived in a language you are still learning. You do not have to translate it tonight. Just hold it gently. Notice it is there. That noticing, Jung believed, is where transformation quietly begins. Chapter 10. The complex that takes over. Imagine for a moment a piece of music that begins faintly in the background of a crowded room. At first, you barely hear it. The conversation is too loud. The activity around you too demanding. But gradually, without your noticing the transition, the music has grown louder. And suddenly you realize it has been filling the room for some time, shaping the atmosphere of the conversation, coloring the way everyone is feeling without anyone quite acknowledging it. This is how a complex works. Jung's understanding of the complex was precise. A complex is a cluster of unconscious material organized around an emotional theme. It has its own logic, its own history, its own way of reading the world. And when it is triggered, it does not announce itself. It simply begins to conduct. The person who has a complex around authority does not think, my authority complex is now active. They simply feel with sudden certainty that their supervisor has it out for them, or that any rule is an insult, or that all institutional power is corrupt. The conclusion feels objective, because the feeling that produces it is invisible. The person with a complex around abandonment does not recognize the complex working. They experience the partner's quiet evening as withdrawal. They feel the silence as rejection. They respond from a place of overwhelming urgency that the partner finds confusing, because from the outside, nothing particular happened. This is what Jung meant when he said, the complex has an ego of its own. For the duration of its activation, it runs you. It speaks through your voice. It makes your decisions. It interprets every incoming signal through its own very particular filter. There is a moment in the story of a man I once read about. Someone who worked in a high-pressure environment. Someone competent and recognized and quietly certain he was never quite good enough when a piece of feedback arrived in an email. Calm, professional, constructive feedback. 3 sentences. He read it 4 times. Each reading made it worse. By the 4th reading, the 3 sentences had become an indictment. By the 5th, a prophecy. By that evening, he was certain his career was ending. He told a friend. The friend read the email. "This is just normal feedback," the friend said. And the man knew somewhere that the friend was right. But the knowing was thin, like ice over deep water. The complex was louder. Notice the weight of your body resting where it is. Jung's insight was not that complexes should be eliminated. He doubted that was even possible. His insight was that complexes become dangerous only when they are completely unconscious. When you cannot see them at work, they run you entirely. The moment you can say, even imperfectly, even in retrospect, I think my old wound was driving that, something shifts. A small but real gap opens between you and the automatic response. That gap is where consciousness lives. That gap is where choice begins. You may not be able to see the complex while it is active, but afterward, in the quiet of a night like this, when the activation has passed and you can look back at it, the pattern may become visible. And patterns, once seen, are never quite invisible again. Chapter 11, when the past feels present. There is something strange and important about memory. Not the kind of memory you can call up deliberately, the names, the dates, the retrievable facts, but the other kind, the kind that lives in the body. In the automatic tightening before a certain kind of conversation, in the feeling of smallness that arrives without warning in a particular kind of room, in the way a certain tone of voice, even a stranger's voice, can produce a response that belongs somewhere decades back. Jung believed the unconscious operates outside of ordinary time. For the conscious mind, the past is the past. It has boundaries. It is located back there, behind you, receding. But the unconscious does not experience it this way. For the unconscious, an unresolved experience is always now, always present, always as emotionally immediate as the day it was first recorded. This is why the past sometimes does not feel past at all. There is a modern patient, I will call her someone's story because it belongs to many people, who had not spoken to her father in 6 years. The relationship had been difficult. The separation was the right choice. And still, at unexpected moments, she would find herself in a state she could only describe as being 7 years old. Not thinking about being 7 years old, actually inhabiting it, the smallness of it, the particular kind of helplessness. It would pass. But while it lasted, the present was unreachable. This is not unusual. This is the unconscious doing what the unconscious does, keeping unfinished experiences in an emotional holding pattern, returning to them in the hope that this time they might finally be processed. Jung was interested in what he called the repetition compulsion, the drive to recreate old dynamics not as a form of self-destruction, but as a form of hope. Some part of the psyche believes that this time the outcome might be different. This time the abandonment will not happen. This time the criticism will not come. This time the need will be met. So we keep finding our way back to familiar territory. different faces, different names, the same essential pattern. Seneca, writing to his friend Lucilius, described a man who moved from city to city, convinced that what troubled him was the place, and found in every new city that he had arrived along with the problem, because the problem was not the place, the problem traveled. This observation, made in ancient Rome, finds its way into every good therapy room in the world. Let the next breath be a little slower. The past does not have to stay present forever. But the first step is acknowledging that it is present at all, not as a failure of the mind, as a signal. Something in you has not finished grieving something. Something in you is still waiting for a different ending. And that something deserves, at some point, to be heard. Not argued with, not corrected, heard. Tonight is a beginning. The ending you need is more than a night away. But the willingness to ask the question, what is this old feeling trying to finish, is how the process quietly begins. Chapter 12. Dreams from the Wounded Mind. In 1913, Carl Jung began one of the most unusual projects in the history of psychology. He had recently separated from Freud, a rupture that left him professionally isolated, personally devastated, and, by his own account, uncertain whether what was happening inside him constituted insight or psychosis. He began to hear voices, inner voices, waking images that felt uncanny and vivid. He recorded them. He drew them in elaborate detail in a large red leather book he called, eventually, the Red Book. He could have dismissed what he found there. He could have medicated himself into silence. He could have channeled everything into professional ambition and kept the interior world firmly shut. Instead, he listened. He took notes. He sat with the figures that appeared in his imagination, and he asked them, "What do you want? Why are you here?" And they told him, not in the way that words tell you things, in the way that meaning sometimes arrives sideways, through image, through symbol, through a feeling you cannot quite name but also cannot dismiss. This is what Jung came to believe about dreams, that they were not random static, not the brain processing the day's debris, not wish fulfillment in the simple sense that Freud had proposed. They were communications from the deeper self to the conscious mind, a language the unconscious used when rational speech was unavailable. And for the wounded psyche in particular, dreams were often where the work continued, where the feelings that had no room in the waking day came alive, where the figures who lived in the shadow came forward and asked to be seen. There is something recognizable in this for many people, the dream that returns year after year. The house in the dream that is almost like a house, you know, but not quite. The figure who is almost a person from your life, but shifted, altered, carrying something you cannot quite interpret. Jung believed these recurring images were significant, that the psyche was returning to them because they contained something unfinished, something that needed integration. He did not offer simple interpretations. He resisted the idea of a dictionary of symbols in which water always means one thing and fire always means another. He believed the meaning of a dream had to be understood in relationship to the dreamer's specific life, specific wounds, specific history. But he believed absolutely that the dreams of people in psychological pain were filled with helpful information. That if a person could develop enough tolerance to sit with the images, not to analyze them clinically, but to feel them, to ask them questions, to let them speak, something useful would almost always emerge. Let your body rest more fully in whatever is beneath you. You may not remember your dreams clearly. You may sleep without obvious imagery. This is not a sign that the work is not happening. Jung believed the psyche's self-regulating function operates continuously, in sleep, in waking reverie, in the moments between thoughts. Even if you have no dreams to interpret, the unconscious is communicating tonight through the feelings that rose before you lay down, through the thoughts that arrived in the space between activities. And if you do dream, if something vivid and strange emerges in the hours ahead, try, when you wake, to simply hold it, not to solve it, just to notice what feeling it left behind. That feeling is a letter from a part of you that rarely gets to speak. It deserves a moment of your attention. Chapter 13, Projection and Hidden Injury. There is a word that gets used often in popular psychology and deserves a more precise treatment than it usually gets. Projection. In Jung's understanding, projection is not simply accusing others of your own faults, though that is one form it takes. It is something more fundamental. It is the mechanism by which unconscious contents are experienced outside of yourself rather than within. Whatever you cannot own internally, you will encounter externally. And here is what makes this relevant to the wounded psyche specifically. The qualities that were rejected in childhood, the anger that was not allowed, the grief that was too inconvenient, the ambition that felt dangerous, the neediness that shamed you, these do not simply wait in the shadow, inert. They become projective. They find homes in the people around you. The man who was told, consistently and emphatically, that anger was not acceptable in a person like him, may find himself constantly surrounded by angry people. Not because he attracts them exactly, because his sensitivity to anger is exquisitely calibrated. He picks it up where others would not see it. He reads it into neutral expressions. And over time, the world begins to feel like a place full of anger that has nothing to do with him. The woman who learned that needing too much was unattractive may feel deeply contemptuous of anyone who expresses vulnerability. She can experience this contempt as a simple assessment of the other person's weakness. But it is charged with something more, with the force of what she has spent decades refusing in herself. This is the hidden injury speaking through projection. The wound does not stay in the room where it originated. It travels, and it speaks through the language of other people's perceived flaws. There is a practical question embedded in this that is worth returning to in your own time with your own life. Think of the person who most consistently irritates you, the quality in them that seems to require almost no energy to notice, the thing about them that feels almost like an affront. Now ask, not to answer immediately, but to hold the question, is there any version of that quality in yourself that you have refused to acknowledge? Not necessarily the same behavior, but the same root. The projection does not require that the other person is wrong or that their behavior is acceptable. It simply asks whether your reaction carries additional heat from somewhere older than this relationship. You may find the answer is no, and that is fine. But if the answer is yes, if there is a flicker of recognition, however uncomfortable, that recognition is gold, because it shows you where the shadow lives. It shows you one of the locked rooms. And locked rooms, once found, can at least be acknowledged. Let the air move slowly in and out. Jung did not say projection is a failure of character. He said it is a structural feature of the psyche, inevitable as long as the shadow remains entirely unconscious. As consciousness grows, projection diminishes, not because you become a better person through effort, but because there is simply less that needs to live outside of you when it is allowed to live inside. The healing of projection is not self-blame, it is reclamation. Taking back the qualities you gave away. Chapter 14. The people who trigger you. Some people slide easily through your life. Others hit something. They land differently. They produce a reaction in you that is fast and strong and not quite proportionate, and long after the encounter you find yourself still turning it over, what they said, what they did, the particular quality of the irritation, or the pain, or the unexpected flood of feeling. These people are not your enemies, even when they feel that way. In Jung's framework, they are often your most important teachers. Not because they are right, not because they deserve the power they seem to have over your nervous system, but because the heat they generate is information. And information, if you can tolerate the temperature long enough to read it, will tell you something about where the wound lives. Think about the specific texture of the trigger. Is it being overlooked, being criticized, being asked to perform, being made to feel small, being controlled, being abandoned without explanation? Each of these has a history. Each of these, if you trace it far enough back, will lead you to an earlier version of the same experience. When the stakes were higher, when you had fewer resources, when the feeling was not just uncomfortable, but genuinely threatening. The person who triggers you now is not the original wound. They are a rhyme with it, a new delivery of an old message. And this is why the reaction seems outsized, because it is not only responding to them, it is responding to everything they rhyme with. There was a man who worked in a collaborative team, thoughtful, respected, good at his work. And there was one colleague, quieter than the rest, slightly given to receiving credit for shared ideas, who produced in him a response he could not explain, a hot, specific fury. He would lie awake, rehearsing conversations that would never happen. He would replay the meetings, sharpen his counter-arguments, build the perfect case for his own worth against this colleague's perceived theft. It went on for months, until something in him was quiet enough to ask, "Where else have I felt exactly this?" And he remembered a sibling, older, quieter, reliably preferred, the same dynamic, the same invisible competition for recognition, the same helpless anger at being somehow unseen. The colleague was not the problem. The colleague had simply unlocked a room. Notice the weight of your body where it rests. The question worth asking gently, and not all at once, is, what old feeling does this person activate in me? And what does that feeling have to do with them? And what does it have to do with something older? You do not owe this question to the person who triggered you. You do not need to share it with them, or forgive them, or transform the relationship. This is not about them. This is about finding out what your nervous system has been trying to tell you. The people who trigger you most reliably are holding, in their particular way of being in the world, a mirror to something you have not yet integrated. That does not make them welcome, but it makes them useful. And usefulness, even in difficult people, is not nothing. Chapter 15. The persona that keeps you safe. Let us return to the mask for a moment. We said earlier that the persona, the social self, the professional face, the version of you that meets the world, is not dishonest, it is functional. It is the necessary adaptation between the private self and the public life. But there is a version of the persona that goes beyond function. That becomes a kind of fortress. And this is where it becomes worth examining closely. The fortress persona develops, usually, in response to pain, in response to an experience of having been seen too clearly and found wanting, or of having been open and been hurt, or of having needed something, showed that need, and been left holding it alone. After enough of those experiences, the psyche does something sensible. It builds higher walls. It trains the persona to be so composed, so reliable, so apparently self-sufficient that no one can ever again catch you needing or wavering or small. The fortress persona is often mistaken for strength. It looks like strength. It maintains composure under pressure. It never asks for too much. It handles difficulty with quiet efficiency. It is, from the outside, the person you would want in a crisis. From the inside, it is exhausting, because the fortress takes maintenance. It requires constant vigilance. It cannot relax, because relaxation risks exposure. It cannot be fully present in intimacy, because intimacy requires the gates to open. And what lives inside the fortress, over time, is not only safety. Loneliness lives there too. The particular loneliness of being seen only in performance, never in truth. Jung was interested in the moments when the persona cracks, when the mask slips, or something happens that the composed exterior cannot manage, and something raw and unguarded comes through. He did not see these moments as failures, he saw them as opportunities. When the fortress cracks, what is inside finally has a chance to breathe. There was a woman who had spent most of her adult life being the dependable one. In every group she joined, she found her way to the same role, the capable one, the organized one, the person who sorted out the difficulty and rarely mentioned her own. She was loved in a reliable way. People trusted her completely. She went to a therapy session during a particularly difficult season, and the therapist asked her simply, "What do you need right now?" She could not answer. She sat for a long time, and then she cried in a way she had not allowed herself to cry in perhaps 20 years, not because the question was painful, because it was the first time in a very long time that anyone had asked. That is the cost of the fortress persona. Not that it fails you, but that it succeeds so completely that it prevents you from being known. Let the next breath come a little slower. The persona is not the enemy, but it needs a door, a place where the self can step outside the role, even briefly, even privately, and exist without performance. That door might be this: the quiet of a night like tonight. A room where no one needs anything from you, where you do not have to manage or produce or handle anything at all. Just you, just breathing, just being. The fortress can stand down for a little while. Nothing will collapse. Chapter 16, Anxiety as a Messenger. There is something Kierkegaard wrote in the 1840s that has never quite left the history of psychology. Anxiety, he said, is the dizziness of freedom. He meant that anxiety is not, at its root, a malfunction. It is the feeling of standing at a choice point, the moment where you could go this way or that way, where the future is not yet written, where you are genuinely free and that freedom has weight. Most of us experience anxiety as purely unwelcome, something to be reduced, managed, dissolved. And some anxiety is genuinely only that, a nervous system running too hot, in need of rest and regulation. But Jung and Kierkegaard were pointing at something different, something worth sitting with. Sometimes anxiety is a signal. It is the psyche noticing that something important is at stake, that a decision matters, that a relationship is carrying more weight than it has been allowed to show, that a life structure no longer fits the person living inside it. The person who feels anxious every Sunday evening before the work week begins may not simply have work stress. They may have an unlived life pressing against the edges of the life they have accepted. The anxiety is asking, is this what you wanted? Is this the direction you chose, or the direction you slid into? The person who feels anxious in intimacy, who experiences closeness as a subtle threat, who finds themselves pulling back at exactly the moment that connection is offered, may not simply be introverted or private. The anxiety may be a very old, very faithful bodyguard, doing the job it was assigned when closeness and pain first became associated. In both cases, the anxiety is not simply noise, it is communication. The question is not only how to quiet it, the question is also, what is it saying? There is a man who came to understand this late in his 50s. He had lived with background anxiety for decades, a low hum of unease that accompanied him everywhere and explained itself as concern about practical matters. Money, health, the future, there was always something. And then his children grew and left. And the practical concerns remained, but the real question, which had been waiting behind them all along, finally emerged. Who was he, now that the structure of his life was no longer filling the space? The anxiety had not been about the things he named. The anxiety had been about this, the existential question beneath the practical ones. And once he could ask it clearly, something in it began to ease. Not immediately, but the anxiety seen became less urgent because it had finally been heard. Notice the air in the room around you. Tonight, if anxiety is part of what you brought to bed, there is an alternative to fighting it. You can ask it quietly, what are you protecting? What are you trying to tell me? You do not have to answer tonight. You just have to be willing to ask. That willingness is not weakness. It is exactly the kind of courage Jung meant when he spoke of the inner work. Chapter 17, The Secret Life of Shame. Of all the emotions that live in the shadow, shame may be the most hidden. This is because shame, unlike guilt, is not about what you did. It is about what you are. It does not say, you made a mistake. It says, you are the mistake. And because that statement feels so total, so threatening to the basic sense of self, the psyche buries it very quickly and very deeply. Shame does not announce itself. It operates under other names. It shows itself as perfectionism. If nothing can be criticized, the shamed self stays protected. As withdrawal, if you do not let anyone close enough to see, the shamed thing remains unseen. As overachievement, if the external accomplishments are extraordinary enough, perhaps the inner inadequacy will be covered. Brené Brown, who spent years studying shame in research settings, described it simply. Shame, she said, is the fear that something about you, if truly seen, would make you unworthy of connection. And Jung would recognize that description precisely. Because what shame does, in his terms, is drive the most tender parts of the self into the shadow. The parts that failed, or needed, or fell short, or deviated from whatever the standard was, those parts get locked away. And the conscious self builds an identity around their absence. The trouble is this. The parts you lock away are often among your most alive parts. The child who is shamed for being too emotional may spend decades performing calm, only to find that the suppressed feeling expresses itself as physical illness or as a confusing blankness in moments that should be meaningful. The teenager who was shamed for their intellectual intensity for caring too much, for knowing too much, for being different in a way that attracted mockery, may learn to hide their real thoughts behind careful social performance. And 40 years later, they may find themselves successful and respected and secretly certain that their real self, the one they hid at 14, would not have been welcome here either. Shame is the wound that most needs compassion, and the one that most resists receiving it, because receiving compassion requires being seen, and the shamed self cannot bear to be seen. There is a way through this that does not require exposing the wound to anyone else. It requires only this: the willingness to look at the shamed thing yourself, to take it out privately from wherever it has been kept, to look at it the way you would look at something a child handed you, with patience, with curiosity, without the verdict already formed. Let your shoulders soften a little. What you find there, under the shame, is almost never the monster the shame promised it was. What you find is usually something much more human: a need, a fear, a longing, a version of yourself that deserved more kindness than it received and never quite forgot the lack of it. That version of yourself is still there, still carrying what it was given to carry, and it does not need anything dramatic from you tonight. It just needs to know that you know it exists. That is enough for now. Chapter 18. The Father Wound. There is a particular shape of absence that Jung tracked through his clinical work and his own autobiography. He called it, in various ways, the father wound. Not a dramatic wound, necessarily, not always a story of cruelty or obvious neglect. Sometimes it is simply a gap, a presence that was physically there but emotionally elsewhere. A man who provided materially and disappeared in every other way. A father whose love was felt but whose approach was conditional, distant, or difficult to read. Jung's own father was a man of quiet faith and quiet sorrow, whose confidence in the world seemed to be eroding. The young Jung watched his father's certainty fail and felt, alongside his love for him, a kind of grief. And something else. A sense that the foundational question, "Who am I in this world?" had not been fully answered by the man who was supposed to help answer it. This wound does not resolve itself simply by growing up and leaving home. The father complex, in Jung's terms, is the cluster of unconscious material organized around the experience of the father figure, and it shapes profoundly the relationship to authority, to one's own authority, to the ability to take up space in the world with confidence. The person with an unexamined father wound may spend their adult life seeking approval from figures who seem to hold power over them: the boss, the institution, the audience, the culture. Not because they are weak, but because something unfinished from early life is still waiting for a particular kind of recognition that never came. Or they may go the other direction entirely, refusing all authority, finding it intolerable to be in the position of the one who must defer or follow, because the original experience of following led somewhere painful. Or they may become the father to everyone around them, dependable, capable, a provider of stability, and find it impossible to be in the position of the child who needs, because that position feels unbearable. There is a man in his late 50s, someone I have read about in this context, who had built a successful life by every visible measure: business, family, community, and in his quieter moments, a persistent sense that none of it quite counted. As if there was some authority he had never received permission from, some blessing that had not been granted. He traced it slowly to his father, a man who had worked hard and spoken rarely, who had expressed pride only once by accident to someone else, and the son had overheard it just once, in passing, and had carried that moment for decades, returning to it the way you return to a single flame in a cold room. Not to condemn his father had done what men of that generation were given the tools to do, but to acknowledge, I needed more than that, and I did not get it. And I have been trying ever since to get it from people and places that cannot give it. Let the next breath be a little slower. That acknowledgement, I needed something I did not receive, is not self-pity. It is the beginning of clarity. And from clarity, a different kind of fathering becomes possible. The kind you give yourself, not as a consolation prize, as something genuine, real, enough. Chapter 19, The Mother Wound. Alongside the father wound, Jung traced another shape of early shaping. The relationship with the mother, or the primary caregiver, is the first relationship. It is the template. It is where the self first learns what it means to be held, to be seen, to be responded to. And it is where the self first encounters the experience of that holding being imperfect, or interrupted, or conditioned on something. The mother complex, as Jung understood it, is not a criticism of mothers. It is an acknowledgement that the earliest relational experience leaves the deepest imprint, that the quality of attunement, the responsiveness between caregiver and child, shapes the nervous system in ways that continue to echo for a very long time. Bessel van der Kolk's research on early attachment found something that would not have surprised Jung. When the earliest caregiving relationship is inconsistent, when warmth is available sometimes and unavailable at other times, in ways the infant cannot predict, the nervous system does not learn to trust the environment. It learns to stay alert. It learns to monitor constantly for the withdrawal of warmth. It learns that love is something you have to earn back, again and again, without quite knowing what you did to lose it. This early learning does not stay only in memory. It becomes a bodily way of being in the world, a chronic readiness, a background scanning for signs of disapproval, a difficulty resting fully in safety, because safety has historically not been permanent. The person carrying this wound may find deep relationships almost impossibly uncomfortable. Not because they do not want connection, they may want it intensely, but because closeness activates the old alarm. The closer someone gets, the more the nervous system anticipates the withdrawal. Or they may find themselves drawn again and again to relationships that recreate the original dynamic. The partner who is warm one day and cold the next. The friendship that feels precious but fragile. The love that has to be continuously re-earned. Not through failure of judgment, through something much older than judgment, the psyche's drive to return to the familiar in the hope that this time it will end differently. Notice the weight of your body where it rests. Understanding the mother wound is not about blame. Mothers are people, complex, shaped by their own wounds, doing what they were given the resources to do. The wound is not a verdict on the mother. It is simply an acknowledgement that what was needed and what was available were sometimes not the same thing, and that the gap between them, the need that was not met, the attunement that was not offered, the security that was not consistent, left something in you that is still trying to find its footing. That something deserves gentleness. Not from anyone else first. From you, the capacity to offer yourself, the steadiness that was not always there in the original experience. The capacity to become, for yourself, a reliable and warm presence. This is part of what Jung meant by individuation, not independence from others, but a relationship with yourself that does not depend entirely on others to confirm that you are safe. That relationship is built slowly, in small moments, in nights like this one. Chapter 20, Loneliness in the Psyche. There is a kind of loneliness that has nothing to do with being alone. It is the loneliness of being around people and feeling unseen, of performing well enough that others are satisfied, while something interior goes unnamed, of having relationships, real, warm, functional relationships, and still feeling, in the private hours, a quiet separateness that social contact does not reach. Jung understood this as a structural feature of the psyche, not a failure of the individual or their relationships. Because the self is not entirely knowable, even to itself. And the parts of the self that have gone into the shadow, the suppressed, the rejected, the unintegrated, these parts cannot receive connection. They are hidden. And what is hidden cannot be reached by the warmth that is offered. The loneliness of the unintegrated self is real and subtle and very common. Irvin Yalom, the existential psychiatrist who spent decades in the room with patients facing the deepest questions of their lives, described this as one of the fundamental human concerns, the irreducible aloneness of the self. The fact that no matter how close another person comes, there is always a room inside you that they cannot enter. Not because love is insufficient, but because the structure of consciousness means each of us inhabits our own experience from the inside. This is not a problem to be solved. It is a condition to be accepted. But Yalom also found something that offered a kind of consolation. When people could acknowledge their aloneness honestly, could stop fighting it, stop distracting from it, stop pretending it was not there, something changed in their relationships. They became more present, more genuine, less armored. Because they were no longer trying to use the relationship to solve an unsolvable problem. They were simply with the other person, not to be rescued from their aloneness, but to share it briefly, in the way that two people can share a view, both seeing the same thing from slightly different angles in the same moment. Let the air move in and out slowly. There is also a loneliness that belongs specifically to the wound. The loneliness of carrying something that feels too large or too strange to share. The parts of your story that you have not told anyone, not because they are shameful, but because you are not sure there are words for them. Or because the last time you tried to say something real, the response was inadequate. Or because you have protected the people around you for so long from your real interior that reopening that door feels like too much. This loneliness is very common in the second half of life. In people who have been capable and giving and present for everyone around them. In people who have very quietly put themselves last for so long that they have lost the habit of existing in first person. Tonight, for these hours, first person is permitted. You do not have to be useful. You do not have to manage anything. You do not have to hold the space for anyone. You can just be here. In the dark, breathing, and that is already enough to be. Chapter 21. Why repetition feels fated. Here is one of the stranger things Jung observed. People tend to recreate the conditions of their original wound, not consciously, not as a form of self-punishment, but with an almost uncanny precision. The person who grew up with a cold, withholding parent seems to keep finding partners who are, in their particular way, cold and withholding. The person who experienced chaotic, unpredictable early environments seems to keep landing in jobs or situations where chaos is the constant. The person who was told implicitly or explicitly that they were not quite good enough keeps finding environments that confirm this. This is not bad luck. It is the repetition compulsion at work. The psyche's drive to return to the unresolved wound, in the hope of finally mastering it, of getting, this time, a different outcome, of writing a new ending to the story that began so long ago. The logic of the unconscious is, if I can recreate the original situation and this time find a way through it, then the wound will heal. The trouble, of course, is that the wound cannot heal through unconscious repetition, because the healing requires consciousness. It requires seeing the pattern, understanding its origins, and choosing something deliberately different, rather than simply following the old groove until the story plays out again. Seneca wrote, and it applies here, that a person who travels restlessly from city to city carries their problem with them and finds it waiting in every new location. because the problem was never the city. The problem was the traveler. This is not a condemnation. The traveler did not choose to carry the problem. The problem was placed inside them before they were old enough to notice. But at some point, and this is the invitation of midlife and later life in Jung's framework, the awareness becomes possible. The pattern becomes visible. And with visibility comes a choice that was not previously available. You can step out of the groove. Not all at once, not perfectly. Old patterns are deep channels, and the water flows back toward them naturally. But even once or twice noticing, in the moment rather than in retrospect, that this situation rhymes with an old one, that itself is progress. That is the gap between stimulus and response beginning to open. Feel the weight of your body resting where it is. There is something Kierkegaard wrote that belongs here. He said, "Life can only be understood backwards, but must be lived forwards." Looking back at your patterns is not the same as being trapped by them. It is actually the opposite. The understanding, once arrived at, belongs to the forward movement. You understand where you have been. Now you can begin to choose where you go. The repetition was not fate. It was loyalty to an old map. It was loyalty. You are allowed now to draw a new one. Chapter 22. The Archetype of the Wounded Healer. In Greek mythology, there is a figure named Chiron. He is a centaur, half horse, half man, which already sets him apart. Centaurs in the old stories are wild, dangerous, ungovernable. But Chiron is different. He is the teacher of heroes. Achilles, Asclepius, Jason, all of them learn under his care. He is the wisest being of his kind, the most knowledgeable in medicine, in music, in the art of war. And then, by accident, an arrow strikes him, a wound that cannot heal. A centaur, known as immortal, now carrying an injury that will not close. He spends the remainder of his long life as a healer, tending the wounds of others with a knowledge that was deepened, made more precise, made more compassionate by the wound he himself carries. This is what Jung called the wounded healer archetype, and he found it not only in mythology, but in the patterns of his own life and in the lives of the most effective therapists he knew. The wound does not disqualify the healer, it qualifies them. Not because suffering grants automatic wisdom, not because pain is automatically ennobling, but because the person who has genuinely traveled into darkness, who has sat with their own dissolution, who has experienced the particular kind of helplessness that comes with an unhealing wound, has access to a territory that the untouched cannot enter. They know something from the inside about what it means to be unable to simply will your way out of pain, about what genuine compassion requires, as opposed to what it merely looks like from a distance. Jung himself was this figure. The Red Book is testimony to it. Years of disorientation, of inner voices, of what he later called his confrontation with the unconscious. Years of not knowing whether he was having a breakdown or a breakthrough. Years of sitting in the dark and taking notes. And from those years, from the wound of his own psychic unraveling, came some of the most useful maps of the interior life that exist. He became more usable because he had been lost. Let the next breath be a little slower. This is not a prescription to remain in suffering. It is not an argument that your wound is fine because it will serve someone. It is something quieter than that. It is the suggestion that the things in your life that have been most difficult, the losses, the fractures, the seasons of genuine darkness, may have given you something that lighter years could not. A sensitivity, a capacity for presence with others who are struggling, a knowledge of territory that most people avoid. The wound you have carried may be the thing that allows you to reach the places in others that remain untouched by those who have never been there. That is not a comfort exactly, but it is something real. And it means the wound was never only loss. Chapter 23, Descent into the Shadow. There is a moment in many myths where the hero must go down. Not forward, not up, down. Into the underworld in Greek myth, into the belly of the whale in the older stories, into the dark forest without a path, into the cave where the monster lives. Jung understood these as symbolic maps of an inner journey. The descent into the shadow, the deliberate turn toward what has been avoided, is the central challenge of what he called individuation. Most of us spend the first half of our lives building upward, accumulating, achieving, constructing the persona, the career, the relationships, the identity. This is necessary. This is not wrong. It is the appropriate work of the ascending half of life. But at some point, and Jung believed this often happens around midlife, though it can come earlier or later, the upward momentum begins to feel insufficient or hollow, or simply wrong in some way that is difficult to name, and the invitation arrives. Not always welcome, not always recognized, to turn inward, to descend. This is not depression, though it can feel like depression. This is not failure, though it can resemble it. This is the psyche calling toward a different kind of work, the work of integrating what was left behind during the long ascent. In 1913, Carl Jung sat in his study in Zurich and faced this descent directly. He called it, in his notes, the beginning of his confrontation with the unconscious. He allowed the inner voices to speak. He descended into the imagery that arose when he stopped controlling his thoughts. He followed it, took notes, drew pictures, for months and years. He was not passive in this. He was not simply succumbing to chaos. He was engaged, deliberately, with what the darkness contained. And what he found, over time, was not destruction. He found figures that had been waiting for him, parts of himself that the successful psychiatrist had no room for, buried feeling, long-suppressed imagination, wild, strange, alive material that could not have fit in his professional life. He did not become those things. He became acquainted with them, and the acquaintance made him whole, in a way the performance of success never had. Notice the weight of your body where it rests. The descent in your life is not dramatic necessarily. It does not require years in a study with a red book. It happens in the small moments of willingness. The willingness to sit with an uncomfortable feeling instead of immediately distracting from it. To ask a question instead of providing a reassuring answer. To let yourself not know for a little while instead of reaching for the nearest familiar explanation. These are small descents, but they add up. They are how the shadow gradually becomes less terrifying and, more simply, yours. The darkness beneath the persona is not what you feared it was. It is mostly just you, the unedited you, the you that was too inconvenient, too much, too little, too real for the life you were building. And that version of you has been waiting with more patience than it deserved to have to show for this moment. Chapter 24, Meeting the Abandoned Self. If there is one image that stays with me from everything Jung wrote and described, it is this one. The self that was put away, not destroyed, not erased, simply put aside. Placed somewhere for later, for when it would be safe, for when the world would have room for it. And then, gradually, over months and years, the later kept being pushed further, until the self that was put away had been waiting so long that even you had begun to forget it was there. Jung described this as the tragedy of modern life more than almost anything else. The waste of potential that comes not from external failure, but from the internal suppression of everything authentic in favor of everything acceptable. He called what remained, what had not been lived, had not been expressed, had not been allowed to exist, the unlived life. And here, at last, is where that phrase lands fully. The unlived life is not the life you never got around to. It is the life that exists inside you and has never been let out. The creative impulse that was mocked in childhood and went underground. The tenderness that was treated as weakness and got converted into toughness. The intelligence that found no welcoming context and turned into sarcasm. The passion that was redirected again and again into safer channels. These are the abandoned selves, and they do not disappear. They persist. They press. They show up as restlessness in seasons when everything seems fine, as an ache that has no name, as the dream that recurs, carrying something you cannot quite identify, but which leaves you with a feeling of recognition. There was a woman, this is adapted from a pattern that appears in many accounts, who had spent 30 years as an administrator, competent, valued, organized, and who, in her 50s, found herself sitting in a ceramics class she had joined on an impulse, pressing her hands into wet clay for the first time in her life, and who wept, not dramatically, quietly, with a feeling she described as grief and homecoming at the same time. She had not failed her life. She had simply not known until that moment how much of herself she had been holding in trust for later, and how much later had already arrived. Let your jaw soften a little. The abandoned self is not lost. It was preserved by the psyche exactly because it could not afford to be lost. The shadow is not only darkness, it is also the repository of what was too bright, too alive, too essential to be permanently dismissed. The question worth sitting with, not urgently, not tonight necessarily, but in the time ahead, is this: what is it in you that has been waiting? Not what you should do with your life, not what would make you more productive or more successful, but what is it in you, the real you, the one that existed before the world had its say, that has been patient for too long? What does it want? Even a small gesture toward it is not nothing. Even acknowledging that it exists is a beginning. Chapter 25. The Therapy of Honest Seeing. There is a moment in many lives when something shifts. It does not always arrive in a therapy room. Sometimes it arrives on a walk. Sometimes in the middle of an ordinary Tuesday. Sometimes, as it seems to come for many people, at the edge of sleep, when the defenses are down and something true rises up, simply because there is nothing left to keep it back. The moment is this: you see something you have been looking past. Not a dramatic revelation, not a collapse, just a quieter, clearer seeing of something that was always there. Jung called this moment of seeing the beginning of real change. Not the insight itself exactly, but the willingness to sustain the seeing, to look again the next day and the day after that, to resist the very natural impulse to take the new understanding and immediately reassimilate it into the old story. Because the mind is very good at neutralizing what it sees. You can have an insight on a Monday, a genuine, important, well-articulated insight about a pattern in your life, and by Thursday have found a way to intellectualize it into harmlessness, to surround it with qualifications until it becomes a decorative idea rather than a living one. Honest seeing requires returning to what you saw, allowing it to be active, not filed away. Brené Brown found, in her research into vulnerability, that the people who had the deepest capacity for connection were not the people who had had the most insight, but the people who could stay with the discomfort of being seen clearly by themselves, by others, without immediately retreating into armor. They could sit in the open field of accurate self-knowledge and not immediately run for cover. That is harder than it sounds, because accurate self-knowledge includes often things that are uncomfortable. Places where the person we have presented to the world and the person we are privately have not been entirely the same. But Jung was insistent that the honest seeing was not cruel. He did not believe in the kind of self-examination that becomes self-condemnation. He believed in the kind that brings things into relationship, where the conscious self and the shadow can begin to know each other, where the persona and the authentic self can stop being strangers. This is not the work of one night. It is the work of a life, but it begins in small moments of willingness, in the decision to look at something rather than past it, in the tolerance of a feeling that used to require immediate management. Let the next breath be a little slower. In Jung's own life, the therapy of honest seeing took years. His confrontation with the unconscious, his descent into the imagery that arose when he stopped controlling his thoughts, this was not comfortable and it was not quick. But he came out the other side, not fixed, not finished, but larger, more whole, more genuinely himself than the successful doctor he had been before the descent. That is what honest seeing offers. Not arrival, not resolution, but gradual expansion. The house, slowly becoming larger than the room you have been living in. Chapter 26, Symbols of Emotional Healing. Jung was unusual among psychologists of his era in one particular way. He took symbols seriously, not as decoration, not as interesting folklore, as functional elements of the psyche, ways the unconscious communicates to the conscious mind when direct language is insufficient. We have become somewhat estranged from symbolic thinking in the modern world. We live in an age of data and explanation, of things that can be measured and verified. Symbols feel soft, ambiguous, unscientific. But Jung would say that this is precisely the problem, that the loss of symbolic life, the inability to receive meaning from image, dream, ritual, story, is part of what leaves the modern psyche feeling impoverished, is part of what makes the journey inward so difficult, because the language of that interior world is not propositional. It does not speak in arguments, it speaks in images. Water, in the psychology of the unconscious, is one of the oldest symbols for exactly this, the depths of the psyche itself. The part that is mostly unseen, mostly unmeasured, but vast and full of life beneath the surface. Fire is transformation, the thing that burns away what is no longer needed. The house is the self, and the rooms within it are the different chambers of the inner life. These are not arbitrary. They appear across cultures, across centuries, across very different traditions of storytelling, because they tap into something that seems to be shared in human inner experience. When a symbol appears in a dream, or in the imagery of a particularly vivid waking state, or in the stories and myths that move you most deeply, Jung suggested treating it not as a riddle to be solved, but as a companion to be known. Not what does this mean, but what does this feel like? What does it bring up? Where does it want to lead? There is a particular image that appears in many accounts of psychological healing, the image of water flowing through a previously blocked channel, the clearing of an obstruction, the return of movement to something that had been still and stagnant. This is often what integration feels like. Not dramatic, not bright, like something that had been held beginning quietly to move. Notice the air in the room around you. You may have your own symbols that carry meaning for you, images, stories, objects, places that seem to resonate in a way that exceeds their ordinary explanation. This is not superstition. This is the symbolic layer of the psyche communicating in its native language. Attending to it is part of the inner work, not by forcing interpretation, by listening. The same way you would listen to a friend who speaks quietly and who will say more if you give them space to, but will go silent if you rush them. The symbol, held with patience, will say what it came to say. Chapter 27, Love After Fragmentation. Something happens in a person who has done even a little of this work. Not always visible from the outside, not always articulable, but real. The way they inhabit relationships begins to shift. Because love, in Jung's understanding, is one of the places where the wound most clearly expresses itself. And it is also one of the places where the healing is most possible. When two people come together without any awareness of their own shadow material, what often happens is an unconscious outsourcing of the work. Each person projects onto the other the qualities they have not integrated in themselves. The relationship becomes a theater for the inner drama. This is why the first phase of love is so dazzling and so disorienting when it fades. In the early stage, the beloved becomes the screen onto which everything hopeful and beautiful that lives in the shadow is projected. They seem luminous, complete, exactly what was missing. They are, for a time, the answer. And then, gradually, inevitably, the projection fades. The ordinary human being beneath the luminous screen becomes visible, and what had felt like a perfect fit begins to feel like disappointment. Jung called this the withdrawal of projection, the moment when you have to begin to see the other person as they actually are, rather than as the shape your longing gave them. This is the threshold where most intimate relationships either deepen or collapse. Because on the other side of the projection withdrawal, real love becomes possible. The love that sees a person as they are, with their ordinariness, their inconsistencies, their own wounds, and chooses them anyway. The love that does not need the other person to be the completion of yourself, because you are in the slow process of completing yourself. Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi, who studied the conditions of deep human engagement, found that the most meaningful experiences in life tend to involve stretching towards something, some challenge that is just at the edge of current capacity. Real love is like this. It requires stretching. It requires the willingness to see and be seen, to be imperfect in front of another person, and to tolerate their imperfection in front of you. That kind of love is not available to the person who has sealed the fortress entirely. It requires the gate to open. Let your body settle a little more into what is beneath you. You may have experienced relationships that followed the pattern of projection and disillusionment. You may have felt the gap between who someone seemed to be and who they turned out to be. That gap is not evidence that love is a lie. It is evidence that the projection, while it lasted, was doing a specific psychological job. The question, worth carrying forward, not for tonight, but for the time ahead, is this: what would it feel like to be loved in a way that did not require you to be the completion of someone's wound? And what would it feel like to offer that to someone else? That love is quieter than the first kind, less dramatic, more sustainable. It is love that has room for both people, all of both people, including the parts they are still learning to call their own. Chapter 28, Anger, Grief, and Renewal. Of all the feelings that live in the shadow, anger and grief may be the most commonly paired. They look different on the surface. Anger moves outward, grief moves inward. Anger wants to push, grief wants to be still. But beneath the surface, they are often the same wound, wearing different clothes. The anger that stays long past its occasion, the anger that seems to have a life of its own, that arrives at unexpected moments, known, that feels bottomless when you thought it was finished, is often grief that has not been allowed to exist as grief, because grief is vulnerable. Anger is not. Grief says, I lost something. I am hurt. I did not choose this. Anger says, something was done to me. And anger often feels, in the short term, more bearable, more like agency, less like helplessness. So the grief gets converted, held in the chest as anger that finds new targets, because the original one, the loss itself, the wound itself, the thing that cannot be undone, is too large to face directly. Jung was interested in what he called the conjunctio, the joining of opposites within the psyche. He believed that real transformation happened at the meeting point of opposing forces, strength and vulnerability, control and release, anger and grief. When these opposites can occupy the same interior space, when you can be both furious about what was taken and genuinely sad about it, without each feeling destroying the other, something moves. Something that had been stuck begins to find its direction. The renewal that follows this kind of integration is not triumphant. It is quiet. It does not feel like winning. It feels more like finally exhaling after holding your breath for much longer than you realized. Fyodor Dostoevsky wrote, in the years after he was led before a firing squad and reprieved at the last moment, that he came to understand life as something to be loved in its specific, small, ordinary details. Not in the abstract, not in the large gestures, in the particular moment, the particular breath, the particular face. His encounter with death burned away everything inessential and left him with a very clear view of what remained. Most of us do not face a firing squad, but we face losses of people, of roles, of versions of ourselves we will not return to. And these losses, when they can be fully mourned, when the grief is allowed to exist without being immediately converted into something more manageable, carry within them the same gift Dostoevsky described, the stripping down to what is actually here. Notice the air moving in and out. You may be carrying grief that has been waiting for permission, grief for a person, for a relationship, for a season of your life, for a version of yourself that grew and changed and cannot go back to what it was. That grief is not weakness. It is the measure of how much things mattered. And when it is allowed to be itself, simply what it is, without conversion, without management, it does not stay forever. Grief, fully felt, moves. What comes after it is lighter, more spacious, closer to renewal than any amount of pushing through ever managed to produce. Chapter 29, The Dream of Becoming Whole. Jung used a word that deserves its own quiet attention: individuation. He spent much of his life trying to define it precisely, and admitted that complete precision was perhaps impossible, because the thing it was pointing to was itself in motion. But here is what he meant, in essence. Individuation is the process by which a person becomes, over time, more fully themselves. Not a different or better person, themselves, with increasing completeness. With fewer of the parts left underground, fewer of the possibilities suppressed, fewer of the wounds running unexamined in the background, it is the lifelong work of integrating the shadow, not conquering it, not eliminating it, but bringing it into conscious relationship, the persona becoming more transparent. The complex is becoming more visible and therefore less automatic. The projections being gradually reclaimed. The dream of becoming whole, as Jung understood it, is not the dream of becoming perfect. It is the dream of becoming complete. There is a profound difference. Perfection eliminates the difficult parts. It aspires to a self with no shadow, no flaw, no contradiction. This is not possible, and the pursuit of it is one of the ways the shadow grows stronger, because everything that does not fit the perfect ideal gets pushed further underground. Wholeness includes the difficult parts. It says, I am a person who contains anger and tenderness, courage and fear, clarity and confusion. I contain contradictions. I am not fully knowable, even to myself. And this is not a problem to be solved. This is the condition of being a human being. The people who have done this work, not perfectly, but genuinely, tend to have a particular quality. Not a quality of having figured things out, quite the opposite. They tend to hold their uncertainty more comfortably. They are less defended, not more. They are softer in the places you might expect to find toughness, and surprisingly steady in the places where you might expect them to be shaken. Because they have visited the dark rooms. They know what lives there it did not destroy them, and they no longer have to spend the enormous energy of keeping those rooms locked. Let the next breath be easy and slow. The dream of becoming whole is not a destination. Jung was very clear about this. It is a direction, a compass bearing. You orient toward it. You move in that direction. You notice when you have drifted, and you correct. And the correction is not punishment. It is simply attention, the willingness to look again. You are already somewhere on this path. You have been on it longer than you know. Every year that has passed, every difficult thing you have moved through, every piece of understanding that arrived, even the slow, reluctant pieces, has moved you further along it than you were. The dream of wholeness is not ahead of you. It is, in some sense, what you already are and are still becoming. Chapter 30. Overthinking and the Split Mind. There is a form of thinking that exhausts itself. You know the kind. The loop that returns to the same question without arriving at an answer. The analysis that goes deeper and deeper into the problem until the problem has subdivided into 10 smaller problems, each of which has subdivided again, and the original question is now buried under a structure of thinking so elaborate that the original feeling that prompted the question has long since disappeared. Jung had a term for this when it appeared in the clinical setting. He called it dissociation from the instincts, the thinking function running independently, cut off from the feeling function, from the body, from the wisdom that lives below language. It is not stupidity. Often it is its opposite, a very high degree of intelligence operating in a sealed chamber. The overthinking mind is often the mind that never learned that thinking and feeling were allowed to work together. That at some early point, feeling became too unsafe, too exposed, too likely to produce the wrong response from the environment, and thinking took over as the primary mode of management. The mind that overthinks is often the mind that was never trusted to feel, and the body, which carries the feeling the mind has displaced, sends its signals in other ways. The tightness, the fatigue, the vague physical symptoms that arrive precisely when a significant emotional issue is being thought about very carefully and also very safely from inside the analytical chamber. There is an image that comes from a conversation I once encountered in this context. A person describing their mind as a room with a very loud air conditioner. The noise of the machine is constant and fills the room so thoroughly that they cannot hear whether anyone is knocking at the door. The overthinking is the air conditioner, and the knocking at the door is the feeling that has been trying to get in. Notice the weight of your body against what is beneath you. Jung's approach to this was not to stop thinking. He was a thinker himself, prodigiously and relentlessly. His approach was to bring thinking and feeling into relationship, to allow the analytic function to be informed by the emotional one, to let the body have a word in the conversation. Psychologist Ethan Kross found that people who could step back from their own thinking, who could observe the content of their minds rather than being entirely inside it, experienced a significant reduction in the intensity of anxiety and distress. The observer position, the slight gap between you and the thought, not to dismiss the thought, but to hold it at a slight angle, to ask, is this thinking for me, or is this thinking at me? Some thinking is generative. It circles the problem and finds the way through. Some thinking is habitual. It circles the problem because circling is safer than arriving at the feeling that would come if you stopped. You may know the difference in your own mind between these two, and if you do not, tonight may be a place to begin to notice. The quiet is always there beneath the noise of the machine. It is patient. It will wait. Chapter 31. The Soul Behind Symptoms. There is an idea in Jung that requires some care in the handling. He believed that psychological symptoms, the anxiety, the depression, the compulsions, the relational patterns that hurt and repeat, were not simply malfunctions of the mind. They were, in some sense, the soul speaking in the only language available to it when more direct communication had been closed off. This requires one important clarification. He was not saying that suffering is deserved. He was not saying that people who are struggling should simply find the deeper meaning and be satisfied. He was not arguing against treatment or support or any of the very real and practical ways that suffering can be addressed. He was saying something more subtle, that the symptom, attended to carefully, often points towards something real, something true about the person's situation, their needs, their unfinished interior work. The anxiety that appears before major presentations may be pointing to a deep and legitimate fear of exposure. The fear that if people see who you really are, they will find it insufficient. That fear is worth knowing about. That fear has a history. The depression that descends in the wake of achievement may be pointing to the gap between the external life and the internal reality, the success that was supposed to mean something and does not, the self that was supposed to feel satisfied and feels empty. These are real signals. They deserve real attention. The insomnia that visits specifically in the quiet of the night, when the doing stops and the being takes over, may be pointing to the parts of the self that have no other opportunity to speak. The soul behind the symptom is not poetic language. It is a practical observation. Behind most persistent symptoms, there is something real that has not been heard. Let the air move through you slowly. Irvin Yalom, who spent decades in the room with people facing death, found that confronting mortality often dissolved symptoms that had persisted for years. Not because death made the problems irrelevant, but because the encounter with genuine finitude stripped away the comfortable distractions and left the person facing what was actually essential. What mattered? What was unlived? What needed to change before there was no longer time? The symptom was often, he found, the psyche's way of trying to reach this confrontation from a safer angle. If I can focus on this anxiety, I do not have to face the larger question that the anxiety is circling. But when the larger question was faced directly, the question of what this life is actually for, who I actually am beneath all the performance, what I have not allowed myself to be, the symptoms often shifted. Not because they were cured by the insight, but because the energy that was being used to create them was freed for something else. For living more directly, more authentically, more completely. Tonight, if a symptom is part of what you brought to this quiet space, let it be here. You do not have to fix it tonight, but you might let it tell you what it has been trying to tell you. It has been patient long enough. Chapter 32. Individuation through suffering. There is a line attributed to a poet that has found its way into many reflections on Jung, and it belongs here in this part of the journey. The descent is not optional, only the manner of it is. By which I mean the encounters with limitation, with loss, with the parts of yourself you would rather not face. These are not things you can successfully avoid. Life brings them, one way or another. The question is whether you meet them with some degree of awareness or whether they meet you entirely on their own terms. Jung believed that suffering, when it is metabolized consciously rather than simply endured or suppressed, carries a specific gift. The gift is not consolation. It is not the discovery that everything happens for a reason. It is something more exact and more useful. The gift is depth. People who have suffered and sat with the suffering, not dramatizing it, not collapsing into it, but genuinely inhabited it and moved through it, tend to have access to a register of experience that the untouched do not. They understand from the inside what the human being is capable of enduring. They understand that things can be very bad and you can still be here on the other side of them. This is not small. Viktor Frankl, in the conditions of a concentration camp where any claim about the meaning of suffering would have been obscene if delivered from the outside, found it from within. He found that those who maintained some relationship to meaning, a person they would return to, a task they would complete, a why that made the how bearable, were more likely to survive, not guaranteed. Nothing was guaranteed, but supported, in the most interior of ways, by the presence of purpose. He was not saying suffering is good. He was saying the response to suffering can be chosen, and that in the choosing, something of the self remains intact. Jung said something similar in different language. He said that only the suffering that has been made conscious becomes transformative. The suffering that is merely endured or suppressed or distracted from remains only suffering. But the suffering that is faced, asked questions of, metabolized through attention and honesty and the willingness to know what it is pointing toward, this suffering becomes part of the person rather than something imposed on them. It becomes territory. And territory you have traveled can be offered to others. Let the weight of your body settle. You have suffered things in your life that you did not choose. Some of them have made you someone you would not have been otherwise. Some of them have given you access to places in yourself that easier years would not have opened. Not everything, not all suffering is instructive. Some is simply brutal, and its only gift is that it ends. But some of what you have moved through has genuinely shaped something in you that is now available to yourself and perhaps to the people around you in ways that could not have existed without the journey. That is not nothing. That is in fact what Jung meant when he called it individuation. Not the absence of suffering, the presence of yourself more fully because of it. Chapter 33. What integration really costs. It would be dishonest to speak of integration as if it were only warmth and arrival and the quiet satisfaction of self-knowledge. It costs something. Jung was honest about this. The process of individuation, of bringing the shadow into consciousness, of withdrawing projections, of inhabiting the unlived life, requires you to give something up. You give up the convenience of the simple story. The story in which your struggles are entirely someone else's fault, in which your patterns have nothing to do with you, in which the problems in your relationships are located cleanly in the other person, in which the wound is a clear event in the past with no current address. These simple stories are comforting. They are, in their way, protective. They allow you to move through the world without the weight of constant self-examination. But they also keep you stuck, because the problems that belong in part to your own shadow, the patterns you are participating in, the dynamics you are partly creating, the needs you have been unable to name, and therefore unable to have met, these problems cannot be resolved from inside the simple story. They require the more complicated version, the version in which you are not only the recipient of things, but also a participant in them, not a guilty participant, not a blameworthy one, but a participant. This is uncomfortable, and the discomfort is real. There is also what gets lost from the persona. When the fortress begins to open, when the composed, capable, needs-nothing exterior begins to loosen, something is genuinely relinquished. The protection it offered was not nothing. The sense of control, the predictability, the appearance of having it together, these served a function. And in the beginning of integration, there is often a period of feeling more vulnerable than before, of not having the armor and not yet having the equivalent groundedness that will eventually replace it, of being between. This in-between period is where many people retreat, where the insight that seems so useful on a Monday becomes too expensive by Thursday, and the old story reasserts itself with relief. Jung did not judge this. He said it is natural. He said the process requires returning again and again to the threshold, that the work of integration is incremental, and each return is worth something even when the retreat follows it. Notice the air moving in and out slowly. What integration costs in the end is the comfortable lie, and what it gives is the real ground. Not always warm, not always pleasant, but solid. Yours, not borrowed, not performed, not maintained through exhausting vigilance. The ground of knowing something true about yourself, even an uncomfortable something, is more stable than any amount of beautiful pretending. And from that ground, a different kind of life becomes possible. Not a perfect life, not a painless one, a genuine one. Chapter 34, The Quiet Return to Self. In the stories of descent, there is always a return. Odysseus comes back to Ithaca. Orpheus climbs back out of the underworld unsuccessfully because he looked back. But the attempt itself is meaningful. The hero who entered the dark forest emerges again, changed. But here, the return in Jung's framework is not a return to who you were before the descent. It is a return to yourself, but a self that is larger, more aware, more inhabitable. The person who comes back from a genuine encounter with the shadow does not look identical to the person who went in. They may look calmer on the outside because they are expending less energy on defense. They may look more uncertain in certain ways because they have given up some confident positions that were held more by force than by evidence. They may look softer in places where they used to be armored, and inside, something has genuinely shifted. Not that the old patterns are gone, not that the wound has sealed itself shut and is no longer felt, but that the relationship to all of it has changed. The pattern is no longer running entirely without the conscious self's knowledge. The wound is no longer unnamed and therefore unlimited in its influence. The shadow, at least some portions of it, have been acknowledged and given some place to exist within the interior rather than in the projections cast outward. There is a particular quality that people who have done this kind of work tend to describe, and it is not dramatic. They describe a kind of quiet. Not the quiet of having no inner life, not the quiet of suppression, a different quiet, the quiet of having less that needs to be managed, less that is being hidden from themselves, less energy going into maintenance of the fortress, a spaciousness where the defensive vigilance used to be. Let your body rest more fully in what is beneath you. You do not have to arrive at this tonight. The return is not a single moment. It is a direction. But tonight, in this quiet, you may be closer to it than you realize. The willingness to listen to these ideas, to let them move through you without immediately arguing with them or dismissing them, this is itself a small form of the return. A moment of turning inward with genuine curiosity instead of defensive efficiency. And the self that was waiting for this moment, the one that was put away, the one that has been patient, the one that went underground when there was no safe place for it above, That self notices. It does not need you to have figured everything out. It just needs to know that you know it is there, and that you are, in your own time, in your own way, making your way back toward it. Chapter 35. Wholeness Beyond Perfection. There is something in what Jung described as individuation that is worth saying very clearly. It does not end. Wholeness, in his understanding, is not a state you achieve. It is a relationship you maintain, a direction you continue facing, a practice of returning again and again to the question of what you have not yet integrated, what you have not yet acknowledged, what you have been looking past. This is not exhausting news. It is actually quite freeing, because it means the work is not a test you can pass or fail. It is simply the ongoing reality of being alive and growing. Some of the most psychologically whole people in the world are not the ones who have completed their shadow work or arrived at some final version of self-understanding. They are the ones who have developed a relationship with the process, who have become, over time, comfortable with not yet knowing, who have learned to hold the complexity of themselves, the contradictions, the capacities, the wounds, the gifts, without needing it to resolve into something simpler. Marcus Aurelius, who commanded the largest empire in the world and wrote in his private journal each day, seems to have understood this. He did not write as a man who had arrived. He wrote as a man who was continuously arriving. Each entry another attempt to see clearly, to align his actions with his values, to understand what in him was running automatically and what was actually chosen. And his greatest texts have endured not because they represent a finished philosophy, but because they represent a mind in honest motion, reaching, falling short, reaching again. That is what wholeness looks like in practice. Not the absence of error or complexity or shadow, the presence of genuine engagement with all of it. Let your jaw soften a little. There is a quality in the people who have walked this path that is, I think, the clearest sign of whatever wholeness means in practical human terms. They do not need to be the hero of their own story. They can be a complicated person in an honest story. They can be someone who has caused harm and repaired what they could, who has been shaped by difficult things and not been entirely ruined by them, who has loved imperfectly and been loved imperfectly in return, and found that imperfect love was still genuinely love. They can hold all of this without it becoming either an accusation or an excuse. That equanimity, that capacity to hold the full complexity of a life without either collapsing under it or denying it, is not perfection. It is something much more useful and much more genuinely achieved. It is the wisdom that comes from a life that has been lived with at least some willingness to see itself clearly. And it grows over time, quietly, incrementally. In moments like this one, in the willingness to listen, in the willingness to ask, in the willingness to be here, in the dark, without needing any of it to be resolved by morning. Chapter 36. A final reflection on healing. We began this conversation with a feeling, something beneath the words of your day, something at the edge of sleep that arrives before you can keep it back. Not quite sadness, not quite fear, something older than both. We said at the beginning that Carl Jung believed this something was not a mistake, that the wound beneath your identity is not a flaw in your design, but the beginning of the story. Over these hours, we have moved through many rooms of that story. We found the childhood self who learned to adapt, who discovered through the ordinary trial and error of growing up which version of themselves was most welcome, and who quietly set aside the rest. We found the persona that formed around those adaptations, the capable, the composed, the needs-nothing exterior that held the world at exactly the right distance. We found the shadow, not dark in the way it is often imagined, but simply unseen, full of everything that was too much, or too inconvenient, or too uncertain to exist in the visible self. Full, sometimes, of the most alive parts. We walked through the rooms where the wound finds its voice, in the people who trigger us, in the patterns that repeat with eerie precision, in the anger that is often grief, in the anxiety that is often the dizziness of an uncrossed threshold. We sat with the archetypes, the wounded healer who finds that the very wound becomes the qualification, not the disqualification. The persona that protects until it imprisons. The shadow that carries what the psyche most needs to reclaim. We spoke of dreams and symbols and the intelligence that moves through the psyche when the conscious mind relaxes its grip. We spoke of love, how it becomes possible, after some of this work, to love another person rather than the projection of your own unfinished business. And we spoke of individuation, the lifelong, never finished, genuinely possible work of becoming more fully yourself. Let your shoulders drop. Let the breath find its own rhythm. There is nothing you need to resolve tonight. What you have heard, you have heard. What has moved in you, you do not need to immediately name or explain. The psyche does not require your conscious supervision to continue the work that was begun. Jung said something that I want to leave you with, because it is both honest and quietly hopeful. He said, and this is drawn from the spirit of many things he wrote, particularly in the letters he sent in the final decades of his life, that the goal is not to become perfect, it is to become complete. And completeness includes the wound. It includes the years you spent in the locked room, the years of the fortress persona, the patterns you ran without knowing you were running them, the parts of yourself you have not yet fully claimed. All of it is part of the story. None of it disqualifies you from what comes next. Notice the weight of your body in whatever is holding you now. You are here, in this room, in this quiet, in this particular night. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, the whole starting point. The person lying in the dark right now, carrying what they have been carrying for as long as they have been carrying it, that person is not broken. They are not behind. They are not the sum of their worst days or their most defended seasons. They are someone who has survived. And surviving, as Jung believed so deeply, is where consciousness begins. The wound beneath your identity is real, and it is also the doorway. Everything you need to walk through it, you already carry. Rest now. Let the night hold what you cannot hold right now. The work will continue. It always does. And so will you. Now the guided practice, which belongs in the final portion of the journey. A practice for the quiet hours. Let us pause here for a moment, not to meditate, not to fix anything, just to notice. Right now, your body is holding you. You do not have to do anything for that to be true. Let your attention move to wherever your body feels heaviest right now. Maybe your legs, maybe your hands, maybe the back of your head against the pillow. There is nothing to change. Just notice. Think gently of the thought that has been circling in your mind today. Not the loudest one, the one that keeps coming back. The one that waits for you when everything else goes quiet. Now, instead of engaging with it, instead of arguing with it or solving it, just see it. Imagine placing that thought on a shelf across the room. It is still there. You have not erased it, but you are here, and it is over there. Notice the distance. You are not your thoughts. You are the one watching them. And the one watching has always been calm. Now bring to mind something Jung described that we have carried through this whole conversation. The part of you that was put away. The self that learned to adapt and in the adapting left something behind. That self is here tonight too. Not as something to fix or retrieve in a single breath, just to acknowledge it exists. You know it exists, and you are no longer looking past it. That acknowledgement, quiet, private, without ceremony, is real. Let one slow breath carry it. And when you are ready, let your eyes close fully, and let the night do what nights are for. You are safe enough to stop carrying everything just for these hours. The weight can wait until morning, and the morning will find you here. The 7-day path. Day 1. Name what you are carrying. Today, name one thing you are carrying that is not entirely yours to carry. A pattern you have inherited. A wound that arrived before you were old enough to refuse it. A story about yourself that was written by someone else. You do not need to do anything with it today. Just name it. Place it in front of you for a moment. Say, there you are. That is enough for today. Day 2, notice the mask. At some point today, pay attention to the version of yourself that shows up in a particular situation, at work, in a family gathering, in any context where you automatically adjust. Notice without judgment, what you add and what you subtract. You are not trying to take the mask off, you are simply learning to see it. Awareness is the first form of freedom. Day 3, follow the trigger. If something irritates you today with a heat that seems slightly larger than the occasion warrants, pause for a moment afterward. Ask yourself quietly, where else have I felt exactly this? Not to solve anything, not to forgive anything, just to trace the line from the present moment back towards something older. That line is information. Day 4, a moment with the shadow. Bring to mind one quality in yourself that you find difficult to admit. Not your worst quality, just one quality you would prefer no one noticed. Hold it for a moment, not with contempt, but with curiosity. Ask it, what were you protecting me from? You may be surprised by the answer. The shadow is rarely what we feared it was. Day 5, speak to the abandoned self. Find a moment of genuine quiet today, even 5 minutes, and speak, silently or in writing, to the part of yourself that was put away, the creative impulse that went underground, the tender place that learned to armor over, the need that became too inconvenient to show. You do not have to bring it back today. Just let it know that you know it is there, that it has not been forgotten. Day 6, let one projection return. Think today of someone whose behavior has recently irritated or moved you in a disproportionate way. Ask yourself, without any obligation to like the answer, whether the quality that bothers you exists in any form in yourself, suppressed, unacknowledged, somewhere in the shadow. If the answer is yes, even partially, see if you can reclaim that quality for yourself rather than leaving it to live in someone else. This is not about them. It is about becoming a little more whole. Day 7, rest as itself. Tonight, before sleep, do nothing productive. Not to recover for tomorrow, not to be more effective. Simply rest because you are a human being who has been carrying something for a very long time. Let the questions you have been holding this week remain open. Let the insights remain incomplete. You do not need to have arrived anywhere by the end of this day. The direction matters more than the distance. And tomorrow you are still traveling. For now, let that be enough.